At the start of the 18th century, France was one of the most powerful countries in Europe. They had military success and trade success. The autocratic kings and nobles lived in luxury and obscene wealth in their palaces, whilst the common man scraped together an existence in poverty. But that was all about to change. Welcome to the channel. I am of course the Knight of History, and this is the very first part of a 5-part series all about the French Revolution. We're going to start off with the Ancien Regime and end with the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. The fact that the Napoleon movie is coming out soon just makes me super excited to do this. I'm also going to go into a little bit more depth than I had previously with the series, so please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Now, let's get into this. France may have been wealthy as ever, but the French politics and French society had changed very little since the medieval ages and feudalism. Therefore, French politics and French society were known as the Ancien Regime. The king was an absolute monarch who ruled with an iron fist from his glorious palace in Versailles, where the king held the court in opulent wealth, and his nobles bid for his attention with various strange ways, like helping him get dressed and undressed and feeding him. This type of court was actually set up by Louis XIV, the Sun King, and he was a strong leader with a great will, and he ruled from 1643 until his death in 1715. His verified reign of 72 years and 110 days is still the longest that any sovereign had ever ruled. But by 1744, the childish and indecisive Louis XVI actually sat on the throne. The French nobility, on the other hand, were extraordinarily powerful. Noblemen could tax peasants, run their own courts of law, and demand unpaid labor for the upkeep of their estates. There was 350,000 nobles in France, but French population was 26 million. But these nobles actually owned a quarter of the French land. Nearly all of the senior clergy members, army officers, and governor ministers came from the French nobility. The Catholic Church actually had 100,000 clergymen in France, and they owned a tenth of the French land. Members of the clergy also didn't have to pay tax and had considerable power over the French population, culture, and education for the time. At the very bottom of French society was the peasantry and everyone else. They made up 75% of the population. Peasants and everyone else had the least money, yet they were in fact expected to pay the most in taxes. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the peasants' annual income was spent paying dues to local landlords, i.e. rent. 1/10 was paid to the Catholic Church and other taxes to the French government. This led to many peasants living in crushing poverty, but they could not really legally do anything about it. Each estate, as they were known, had the same voting rights. The first estate were the clergy, the second estate the nobles, the third estate were the peasants. Therefore the peasants' voting rights were there, they just weren't as strong as the other two, especially when the clergy and nobles would often vote for the same things. The third estate pretty much had a useless vote. Then all of a sudden, the Americas were revolting against the British. France, the lifelong enemy of the English, sent aid to the Americans in the form of battleships and supplies and troops. The outcome being that George Washington's US Army was victorious thanks to the French. But even though it was an important victory for the French, the war still left France an enormous amount of debt. Louis XVI knew that in order to pay off this debt, he needed to reform the entire French taxation system. A series of financial ministers tried to pass reforms in the French government, trying to make up the aristocracy to pay these taxes. But because, of course, the aristocracy made up most of the government, none of these reforms actually passed. Why would they pay more? By 1788, France was in crisis. A cold winter and a dry summer led to poor harvests, which caused the price of bread to rise, levels which is too high for peasants to afford. This led to many of the peasants actually starving. Some of France's growing middle class, now known as the bourgeoisie, were calling for more radical reforms to the government and taxation. But France was in massive debt and on the verge of bankruptcy. This was, of course, while nobles and royals lived in luxury and palaces. Famously, the Austrian Archduchess, who became the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, incorrectly was quoted by saying, "Let them eat cake instead of bread." She would also spend £20,000 in today's money on clothes per day. In absolute desperation, King Louis XVI agreed to call the Estates General. The Estates General was a meeting between all three estates: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the aristocracy; and the third estate, the rest of the population. By now, the third estate was mainly represented by members of the bourgeoisie, the rich middle class. The last time an Estates General was actually called was in 1614, 175 years before 1789. Previous kings had used the Estates General to approve government reforms, but Louis XVI wanted them to approve his new taxes. The Estates General met on the 5th of May 1789 in the Palace of Versailles. There were 300 members of clergy, 291 aristocrats, and 610 members of the third state, the bourgeoisie. Now, on arrival to Versailles, you can imagine it's a very opulent place. Louis XVI received the first and second estates in the magnificent Hall of Mirrors. Members of the third estate, however, were refrained from entering into the Hall of Mirrors. Additionally, the second estate was permitted to wear satin suits, silver waistcoats, and silk cloaks, whilst the third estate were forced to wear plain black coats to identify them. The Estates General had long-running disagreements about the third estates, whether they should keep their powers to vote out the first and second estate. In reality, the first and second estates were just vetoing whatever the third estate said. They were just saying, nope, that's not going to work for us. Sorry, not happening. The third estates were obviously treated really, really badly, and they became angry. They were angry at the point that they had no real reason for being there, because they couldn't really do anything. They couldn't get any votes across, even if they did represent most of the country. So, on the 13th of June, 1789, something nearly unthinkable happened. The third estate broke away from the Estates General and formed a new body they called the National Assembly. They all took what is known as the tennis court oath. In a tennis court, the National Assembly swore not to stop meeting until France had its own constitution. This was a commitment to impose a constitution on France, which meant that the king would lose their power. Rumors quickly began to spread that Louis XVI planned to shut down the National Assembly with the help of 20,000 French soldiers and foreign mercenaries who were stationed all around the city of Paris. Now, I have to actually remember here that the French people had been starving, and for no real apparent reason. Their country was powerful and rich. The people across the Channel, also from a rich and powerful country in England, were living a good life, but the French weren't. Why not? Germany, not even a country yet, was also living well. So the French were just sick and tired of this situation. Therefore, the people of Paris became increasingly angry. And all of a sudden, on the 11th of June, 1789, the finance minister, Jacques Necker, resigned after a number of disagreements with the king. This would, of course, turn out to be the very last straw. 3 days later, on the 14th of July, a furious mob of Parisians had organized a revolt. They stormed the barracks, taking 28,000 musket guns. Quickly, soldiers from the French army began to desert their posts, and instead of repulsing the mob, they joined them. As it grew, the mob moved to a large medieval fortress in the city center of Paris, a fortress called Bastille, where they stormed through Bastille, placing the head of the governor of Bastille on a pike, freeing prisoners and taking up gunpowder and ammunition. Now, on hearing about the storming of the Bastille, Louis XVI was actually advised not to suppress the rebellion with his army, because it was understood that the troops may not actually follow his orders. they may in fact join the mob, so why bring them there to create more of a mess? It was clear that Louis XVI had lost control of his own country, and that the French Revolution had begun. Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope that you enjoyed that. Next time we are going to get into, and spoiler alert here, the execution and the reign of terror. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. The more you know.